Let's go on to point 5. We're role models for other believers. Every one of us is role model. We don't necessarily like to be role models, but we are role models to others. We are examples of what a Christian is to others. Everybody that knows we're a Christian, we're an example to them of what a Christian is. Wouldn't we like to not be an example at times? Last year sometime I was heading up to Golden Valley, and there was a lot of traffic. I wanted to get off on Golden Valley Road, and there was this guy. He wouldn't let me in, and I looked at him, like, come on guy, let me get in here. And he flipped me off, and as he went forward, I saw the fish on the back of his car. Well, interesting. Okay, the point 5 is older Christians, older believers in most churches are not being a model of discipling. Point 6, we talked about earlier that most church pastors in the Western church are so busy, they don't have time to devote to giving individual attention to new believers. And yet the Word says to be examples. What's a typical pastor being an example of? It's just realistically, it's just an issue of logistics. We believe the key is for leaders to train faithful people in the congregations who can share the responsibility. In point 5, referring to older believers, typically older believers are not discipling. So the new believer comes into a congregation, they look at the older believers, and why should they think about becoming disciplers if the typical person in the congregation is not modeling being a discipler? And yet, what's the Great Commission? To make disciples. For who's supposed to do that? Yeah, exactly, all of us. But if it's not being modeled by older believers, and if it's not being modeled by the typical leader, why should we expect the new believer to think that this is something that I should be pursuing? We need to stress this again and again. Corporate discipleship is something that's needed, but it's not by itself sufficient to end up with healthy believers. The same is true of our families. Do we not raise our children in the same way, both corporately and individually? The typical believer feels inadequate to take them beyond salvation. The typical believer thinks that when a new person becomes a believer, then I'm inadequate to take them beyond salvation. I'm just be thankful that I was involved in them becoming a Christian, let alone what to do with them afterwards. It's a shame the way the Western church has this mindset that only qualified people can do the work of the service. And last week, we were reading in Ephesians where the leaders are given to equip the saints for the work of service. It's the saints who should be doing the work of service, not the leaders. The leader's job is to equip. It's a Christian's responsibility to be doing the work. It's really sad. Our intention with this lesson is not to criticize, to find fault, but rather to give us a better understanding of what is happening. Hopefully this is like an x-ray, and you take an x-ray, you don't criticize the x-ray. The x-ray is hopefully exposing, revealing what the problem is so that you can correct it. That's the goal of this lesson, is to help us to identify what needs to be corrected so that we can correct it. The goal is not to find fault or cast blame or anything else, but to what can we do to help believers. We can look at other believers and say, here's a believer and they don't want to do this or they don't want to do that, we need to understand why they are found in that situation. We need to understand what the thinking is. Why isn't the typical believer discipling? We need to understand why. The point of point 6 is that leaders need to be modeling what they expect followers to do. And leaders are often simply dispensing biblical information, but not modeling something that the typical believer can actually duplicate. The typical leader is modeling what? Preaching or teaching. Well, most believers don't see themselves as duplicating that. Do we expect the typical believer to follow example of going to a Bible school or seminary? It's unreasonable to think that the typical believer is going to go to a Bible school or seminary, which they would have to do to duplicate the example that's being held out before them. It's not to say that Bible school or seminary is bad. It's just to say that that's unrealistic for most believers, okay? Would somebody read Luke 6:40?
NIV says, a student is not above his teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like his teacher.
Yeah. What's the key word there? We have a specific reason for reading that verse. What is the key word in that verse? One word. The word like. What does that mean? What's being conveyed by this verse? What's the difference between a student and a disciple? Is a disciple a student? Okay, a disciple is a student. Is an apprentice a student? Okay, an apprentice is a student. What is the difference between a student and a disciple? The key thought here, why we use this verse, is because Jesus is differentiating between somebody that is just acquiring knowledge versus somebody that wants to become like the teacher. The disciple has the goal of being like the teacher. In our application, becoming like the discipler. If we understand that the disciple is going to become like the teacher or the discipler, that makes the discipler a role model, doesn't it? If your goal is just to present biblical knowledge, you can kind of de-emphasize the idea of role model. Because the typical person that stands up at a seminar is imparting knowledge. They're not thinking, I want you to become just like me. They're imparting knowledge. But the disciple is a different creature. The disciple has the goal of becoming like the person they are being discipled by. When a person becomes a Christian and a discipler is in their life, the goal of the discipler, of course, is to help the newer believer to become like Jesus. But meanwhile, whether you want to be or not, the discipler is a role model for the disciple. This is one of the functions of a discipler, is to be a role model. The difference between a student and a disciple, the student wants to know what the teacher knows, knowledge by itself. The disciple wants to be like the teacher. That's very important. There's reluctance by many Christians to make a commitment that they perceive may interfere with or limit their lifestyle or plans. Is this true or not? Discipling somebody is going to impact your plans, maybe. Have your children impacted your life? No, that's what I thought. A child just takes up all your energy. You know, you're always thinking about where the child is, what the child needs. Spiritually, there's an impact too. Discipling somebody is draining. It's exhilarating. It's thrilling. It's so neat to watch somebody grow. there's also expenditure of resources. There's a deep concern. A problem in the Western Church is that biblical information, while being good, is typically presented in random order. In other words, if you as a new believer were to go to a dozen different churches and each Sunday go to a different church, you would typically be listening to a dozen different sermons or teachings or whatever, right? The new believer, how are they supposed to fit what they hear into the picture? That's difficult for the new believer. I often give the example of building a house. If you were going to describe to somebody how to build a house, and I say to you, lay out 20 steps to building a house. The key steps to building a house. Okay, let's take a look at the first 5 steps. Would you start with telling them about the carpeting? Or how about the siding? Or how about the roof? Or how about the cabinets? Are those things needed in a house? We would say, yeah. Those are not optional things, but they're not the first things that are most important. And yet this is typically the way in the Western Church, the typical way that biblical information is passed on to new believers is typically in random order. You see, if a new believer is simply taught corporately, they will be listening to a teaching or a sermon or whatever. A new believer could go to a dozen different churches on any given Sunday and hear all kinds of good things, needed things. We never want to imply that biblical information is bad. But in addition to hearing the good things, the new believer needs to understand what are the critical things. The new believer needs to understand how to deal with sin. How long after a person becomes a believer do they start having to deal with sin? Usually pretty quick, right? The new believer typically has the idea that, oh, now I have salvation, now I have a new life, and you hear a verse something like, behold, all things are new, old things have passed away. What does that imply? Man, I have a new life, my sins are forgiven, and I am going to grab the world by the tail. I am not going to sin anymore. God is going to bless me. I'm just going to have a wonderful life. And then what happens? They sin. Yeah, reality sets in. What do they do with this new reality? They come to the conclusion, I guess it didn't take. I guess I'm not a new believer. I guess I don't have enough faith. I guess I don't know the Bible well enough. I mean, you can come up with a whole bunch of reasons of why what you thought was not going to happen, happened. That's why the new believer needs somebody coming alongside of them and helping them to get through this initial period of the Christian life. Because every Christian is going to go through a reality check. It's happened to every one of us. Every one of us had high expectations at the beginning of the Christian life that soon came down to earth. Every one of us has gone through that initial period when we thought that everything was going to be great, and then all of a sudden when the rubber hits the road, we realize, why do I feel so defeated? Why do I feel so down? Why do I feel so depressed? And we start asking questions that we don't have answers for. And this is why we need somebody that can come alongside of us and give us some answers. But why does a Christian have to go through this period if there's other believers that can help them through the initial stages of the Christian life? This is simply a rough guideline, just to be thinking as you're discipling somebody, a reminder of the need to present biblical truth in a progressive sequence, in the same way that you're building a house. Random information is good, but as you think of anything that, like building a house, or as we use the illustration of presenting some kind of a presentation, like a slide presentation or whatever, there is a sequence to a presentation, and we need to just think about what are the things that a new believer needs? What are the first things that they need? And, looking at this list, starting from the bottom, Jesus, my rock and foundation, of course, salvation is the most important thing, which everything else is resting on. Where we go from then is a simple overview of the Christian life, then what happened at salvation, why I now have two natures, introduce the Holy Spirit, or explain the characteristics of our old nature. And why is that important? Because typically it's conveyed to new believer many times that when you become a believer, now you're a new creature. Well, that's true. But what does that mean? God's solution for victory in the Christian life is not to eliminate the old nature. That's not God's provision. God's provision is to walk in the Spirit. That needs to be explained to the new believer so that, when a new believer comes to the realization that I am tempted as a believer, I'm being tempted in the same way I was as an unbeliever, some of the things that I thought would no longer be evidenced in my life, I'm seeing things I don't like in my life. What is the new believer going to conclude if they see something in their life that they felt was something that wouldn't be there as a believer? I guess maybe I didn't understand. Maybe I wasn't sincere. There's all kinds of conclusions that a new believer can arrive at, most of which are not good, that are a result of not realizing that when you become a believer, the old nature is not eliminated. Now, what happens is that the old nature is made powerless. Being made powerless is not the same as annihilation. It's just a simple truth that needs to be explained to the new believer. And then, of course, the lordship decision that typically, as we've said before, that to the new believer, it's not a big deal. It's simply who's in charge of your life. That is not a big deal to new believers. It's a big deal to old believers. And why is that?
We think we know better than God what's in our best interest. I think I know what makes me happy. I think I know what's the best for me, and I like being in control.